Hello, this is Kamaljit from Darwin in Northern Australia. We live in very tropical part of the world and a very rich, socially very rich environment where we have many Indigenous communities living across the North. So I'm very fortunate to have this opportunity to present for the Indigenous Forum this year. And I hope that next year this kind of forum is held in person. Before I proceed, I would like to share my screen and present my talk on emerging business opportunities in Indigenous land sector. So to start, I would first like to pay my respect to the Aboriginal people of Larrakia Nation, whose land we stand here, that help us to survive, and also to Aboriginal people across the globe who have been managing their lands beautifully to support our living. So just a quick outline for my talk is that I'll first give you a bit of background where I come from, and then a little bit of introduction about Indigenous peoples and local communities' land management skills and how we need to recognize them. I'll then take on to the real context for this talk, which is fire management in Northern Australia, and that has led to carbon economy. So we'll talk a lot more in detail about those two topics, which then will help us to lead to future ecosystem services-based business opportunities that I would like to discuss with you all in detail. So a bit of my background, I come from, you can say, from a local agriculture community from northern India, but I've been living in Australia for the last 20 years, working with Aboriginal people across the north. Up here, I work as a senior ecological economist. My background is in ecology, but I have moved on to economics, mainly to link the ecosystem services that flow from the natural systems to Indigenous well-being. So just those who are not much aware of ecosystem services concept, these are the benefits. Ecosystem services are the benefits that people obtain from managing their natural systems, or bush, for example, bush food, bush medicine, the cultural activities that we do, the cultural practices that we continue to perform over the years. So all those kind of benefits, they fit under that ecosystem services framework. So I work at the Darwin Center for Bushfire Research at Charles Darwin University, which is pretty much in the tropics up here. But this area, there are about 200 communities living across the north. So very rich and diverse northern landscape. To start my talk, I think most of us are aware of there are about 2.5 billion Indigenous and local communities worldwide. Among them, 370 million people are Indigenous. They are living across 19 countries, representing about 5,000 cultures. Most importantly, these people manage about 50% of the global landscape, landmass, which is mostly managed through communal arrangements. So one thing that we all need to recognize is that since this 50% of the landmass is managed by the Indigenous peoples and local communities in a way that is not extractive, that's been done by the mainstream society, I guess we are still able to sustain on this planet Earth. If we would have lived the way the mainstream society lives in the Western world, we would have exploited Earth's resources that it would have become hard for us to survive on this planet. So we need to recognize the importance of indigenously managed lands. And I also want to recognize the local communities living across the world who contribute hugely in this space as well through their sustainable practices. And the culture that goes on from one generation to another. Just to explain a bit about Indigenous land management from Northern Australian perspective, and I think this is true at many other parts of the world as well, people have a two-way relationship with their lands. So this is in contrast to the common perception about deriving benefits from the natural systems, where people think there is a one-way relationship with the natural systems, where we think that the natural systems are there for humans to make use of them. But in many Indigenous communities, the key is that if we manage our natural systems well, we will drive our well-being benefits as well. So in this picture, in this figure, this all green background is what we call country. So from Indigenous perspective in Northern Australia, country is the traditional land where people have got their familiar relationships that goes on from generation to generation. So when people manage their country well, people are happy. So if the country is sick, people feel sick. So there is this two-way relationship. And this two-way relationship is managed through their cultural norms and ceremonies, which in scientific language, we say ecosystem management. And because these cultural norms and ceremonies help them to care for their country, and that also involves their Indigenous governance. And embedded within that system is people's capabilities, the knowledge and skills that they gain by doing those ceremonies from their elders, and that help them, the Indigenous people, to derive benefits from their country and to enhance their well-being. So when the country is managed well, there are a lot of services that people can derive from managing their country or managing their land. There are socio-cultural and livelihood benefits. There are biophysical ecosystem services such as climate change, as many of you may be aware of, biodiversity protection. The socio-cultural benefits include like, the dances out on country, the cultural knowledge, traditional learning that's embedded within the country, and then people's capabilities doing things on land. Celebrating ceremonies, looking after land, managing fire, managing land in a way that's culturally appropriate. So managing this country in a holistic way actually delivers a range of benefits, not just the socio-cultural, but also the biophysical benefits. So one example of these is, this is fire management in Northern Australia, that we will dig a little bit deeper into it. And before I dig deeper, I would like to provide you a bit of context. So this is a map of Australia. So I'm talking about the northern part. So we live somewhere here, which is Darwin. And this is the tropical savannas, all this light yellow part. So tropical savannas are the kind of ecosystems where we got a kind of discontinuous tree cover, but with extensive grassland systems underneath. So these tropical savannas here, they've been managed by the Indigenous people over thousands and thousands of years. And fire has been a key tool. And we'll talk a lot more in detail about that. So just to describe Indigenous land rights and the distribution of Indigenous communities across Northern Australia. So this green boundary here is within those savannas that I have shown before, but above 600 mil rainfall. And I'll come to that point why I'm talking about this. But this dotted blue, black line shows the savanna country. But you can see how many Indigenous countries, nearly about 200 Indigenous communities distributed all across the landscape. So this is unlike non-Indigenous communities, non-Indigenous people who are mainly concentrated in 4 or 5 towns across the north. You may have heard about Keynes, Townsville, Darwin here, and Broome here. So indigenous people being dispersed across the landscape actually do a great favor for looking after their land for many people regionally as well as globally. And I'll highlight those points as we move. So history of fire management across Northern Australia. Uh, no, Northern Australia is colonized much later than the southern part of Australia. So in 1850s, until then, Aboriginal people used to use fire as a tool to manage this highly fire-prone, vast and open landscape. This landscape is very fire-prone due to lightning in these months of the year. So in September, October, because it's very dry, there is a lot of fuel load buildup on the ground. As I said, these are open savannas with extensive grassland systems. So with build up that fuel load, when the lightning strikes with the onset of wet season, which starts in November, we get a lot of wildfires that burn thousands and thousands of kilometers. So traditionally, Aboriginal people used to practice burning, applying their traditional knowledge and skills. But their practice was greatly compromised with the European settlement in 1850s. So how they used to manage, when people used to walk, they used to, what we call now prescribed burning, they used to lit fires, small patchy fires, and that used to create a mosaic within the landscape. So whenever a wildfire will, if the lightning hits a wildfire somewhere here, then it won't spread across the landscape because there will be breaks within the landscape. So it's a very mosaic landscape. But what happens when, with colonization, a ban was put on traditional burning? It resulted in a lot of wildfires burning thousands and thousands of kilometers across Northern Australia, something like this. So you may hear a lot of stories from Southern Australia, but this is a common scene in Northern Australia. Every year you get lots of wildfires. So burning has been a traditional practice. Traditionally, people lit small, petty, cool burns, but very early in the dry season. So dry season for us here in Australia is March to July, where the rainy season stops in about March, and then people start lighting small, petty fires to create the mosaic within the landscape. What this leads to is less fuel accumulation. As I said, that there are lots of open grassland systems within the savanna landscape. So reducing that grass fuel, it leads to less fires during the late dry season. So in the late dry season, otherwise, due to lightning, if we don't burn that fuel, grassy fuel on the ground, then in the late dry season with lightning, those fires can spread thousands of kilometers. However, there has been change in the past 20 years. The scientists and the traditional owners, they have collaborated and developed some methods which we say now prescribed burning, which are again like the patchy, cool burns early in the season, which we call early dry season, which is March to July, and that saves the country from extensive wildfires. So just to give you a bit of background, that in Northern Australia, if you look at fire frequency, all these red and yellow areas, they get burned almost every second year. So this is an average fire frequency for 20 years. So you can see that almost all this area that gets burned or every year or every second year. Compared to southern parts where burning occurs once in few years, but that once it occurs, because they don't manage the fuel, grass fuel, it spreads widely and there are huge losses. So how to control those wildfires? There has been a bit of awakening call, and that happened when Australia signed the Kyoto Protocol. So sometimes these international agreements, they can actually trigger a big change at the national and local level. So under this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, when Australia signed the Kyoto Protocol in December 2007, so we made the climate agreements that Australia will reduce its greenhouse gas emissions 5% below 2000 levels. So to do so, then they have to develop their domestic policy. Under this domestic policy, then we have got this one beautiful arrangement with what we call Emissions Reduction Fund. And this is the one I will be going a bit more in depth. So under this Emissions Reduction Fund, which is one of sitting under the domestic policies, that there are about 35 different methods through which the government incentivize the abatement of greenhouse gas emissions so Australia can meet its targets, which is 5% below the 2000 levels. So this international actually arrangement helped Australia to think locally, to support those emissions reduction fund projects, which deliver huge benefits to Indigenous communities. And the way it's been done, under that, when Australia signed Kyoto Protocol, under that arrangement, savanna wildfires, they emerged as an important source of greenhouse gas emissions. So, and they are recognized, abatement of greenhouse gas emissions from wildfires is well recognized under that convention. So the wildfires, they usually contribute up to 3 to 4% of the total national inventory. So which is huge. So that's all the wildfires in this area, and the wildfires look something like this, and it's a huge load of emissions. So the solution that government proposed, they developed an emissions reduction fund, which we call ERF. It is a kind of incentive mechanism for managing wildfires. Under that emissions reduction fund, it's been established in 2012 as an extension of that carbon farming initiative. So the government made an act, which is called Carbon Farming Initiative Act in 2011. And under that act, this emissions reduction fund was set up. So initially government invested about $2.5 billion, which is a voluntary scheme. And recently in 2019, it has been extended with another $2 billion. So what the emissions reduction fund does, it provides incentives for the businesses and the landholders to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is applicable to wildfires, managing wildfires. So under that emissions reduction fund, savanna burning methodology, which is about controlling wildfires in the savannas, abating greenhouse gas emissions by putting those cool, patchy burns early in the dry season, what we call prescribed burning, is recognized as formally recognized as savanna burning methodology. So if we manage wildfires applying cool patchy burns early in the dry season, and we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, then we can claim these carbon credits. So the one ton of greenhouse gas emissions abatement is equal to 1 Australian carbon credit unit. So that carbon credit unit, then you can sell in the market to fetch some dollar value. So there has been some tools developed for this, how to estimate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. We got a NEFI website, which is North Australia Rangeland and Rangeland Fire Information website that tells us about the fire history. And there is another tool, what we call SABBAT, that helps us to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions abatement. So with these tools, if a landholder applies petrichor worms early in the dry season before the 1st of July, then they can claim for the abatement of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of Australian carbon credit units, which you can either sell in the private sector or you can sell it in the government sector under this emissions reduction fund. So overall, the way this whole mechanism works is that there are wildfires happening across the savannas. These are frequent bushfires. They contribute to climate change, emitting 3 to 4% of greenhouse gas emissions to the Australian inventory. And under that emissions reduction fund, which is a kind of payment for ecosystem services, in this case, climate regulation. So managing those bushfires, then you can contribute to healthy country, which means that there are less wildfires, beautifully managed country. So we abate greenhouse gas emissions, which deliver us these Australian credits for carbon units. One credit is somewhere around $10. These days, it's about $15.74. So one unit. And then having that money, it helps Indigenous communities to appropriately run their local economies. And it helps people to build their capacities to manage the bushfires. So overall, there are multiple benefits through this program. So controlling wildfires delivers obviously many environmental benefits, protecting biodiversity, mitigating climate change, managing land and water resources, and then it also enhances the resilience of remote Indigenous communities. So it enhances natural, social, and built capital. So there is a less risk for the built capital to be destroyed by those wildfires. That means that this arrangement, it leads to sustainable ecosystems and sustainable regional economies and communities. So it's a quite sustainable kind of cycle with some financial investment from the government. So at this stage, what we call these savanna burning or carbon projects, there are about 76 projects across the north. And this savanna burning methodology is applicable above 600 mil rainfall. So it's sitting within the savannas. Savannas cover about 1.9 million square kilometer area of northern Australia. But above this 600 mil rainfall area is about 1.2 million square kilometers. So all the savanna burning projects or the carbon projects are within this range. There are 76 of them. They cover about 29 million hectares of land, and they abate about 7 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions since their implementation in 2012. Most importantly, out of all these projects, 27 are on Indigenous land, and they abate about 5 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we look especially on carbon projects on Indigenous land, they cover a total area of 18 million hectares, and they deliver about 5 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions abatement. And that abatement is, if we look all across northern Australia, is worth about $16 million if I use the minimum price for carbon, which is about $10. The actual price could be somewhere around $30, as some of the Indigenous companies have been selling to private companies, and they could fetch a bit higher carbon price than what has been set up under the emissions reduction fund. So there are huge benefits of managing fire across the north. So one of the things that's quite apparent now is that over the years, since the start of this emissions reduction fund and savanna burning program, the late dry season wildfires have reduced significantly. You can see all these brown areas in this map and before savanna burning methodology was applied. And if you see the area under here, after savanna burning methodology, there is a huge reduction in these brown areas, which is about 25% of the total area. So what it means to have less wildfires, that means we are managing our natural resources really well, protecting our biodiversity, mitigating climate change, protecting land and water resources, and also the very productive systems such as agriculture, because otherwise there is a huge risk for them to be exposed to wildfires. Above all, there is a huge benefit for many indigenous communities who are involved in this work. So the key benefits for indigenous communities to be involved in this prescribed savanna burning program is that it's a huge source of employment. There are about 650 ranger positions across the north. And this is very important for indigenous communities who are spread across the north, and there are not many economic activities happening in those remote areas at all. So having these ranger positions in those remote locations is a wonderful thing that has enabled Aboriginal people across the north to work and live on their country. While doing so, they provide a lot of services for non-Indigenous people regionally and globally, such as mitigating climate change. And these local economic opportunities, they are culturally appropriate, and people feel attached to their land. It has revived people's cultural practices, and moreover, they deliver monetary benefits, which is worth about $40 million carbon industry. So this savanna burning program has been delivering many social and cultural benefits, including providing opportunities for learning on country, building and utilizing traditional knowledge. It enables people to pass on elders' knowledge, so the list of benefits goes on and on. It has enabled people to meet their cultural responsibilities and to conduct their ceremonies. So this kind of program has enabled people to build their capabilities and also empowered communities. People feel much more attached and to be with themselves having this kind of program. Above all, there are huge well-being benefits. So I did a bit of economic analysis, having 50% of the eligible workforce to be involved in these savanna burning projects. So the total benefits that it can deliver to the government is worth about $500 million a year. And if we look at carbon sequestration benefits, because so far I have talked about greenhouse gas emissions abatement benefits, not the sequestration benefits that could happen, sequestering carbon in the woody vegetation and also in soil. So that could add another $17–18 million a year. So if we look at look at the Northern Territory, which is this part in Northern Australia, so there are huge well-being benefits for involving Indigenous people living across country into savanna burning programs. So the reason I'm saying this is that we need to bring that policy change within the government sector to inform them about their cost savings and also the multiple benefits that flow from indigenously managed lands. If we look at the key global environmental issues these days, they've been highlighted by Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services by IPCC and many others. So we got climate crisis, we got biodiversity loss, We have deforestation and land degradation. We got pollution. We got so many problems happening across the globe. And to handle those problems, one of the key things that I keep on mentioning is we need to support indigenous peoples and local communities in managing their lands. So if indigenous people and local communities manage their land sustainably in their way, there are many cross-sectoral benefits. So a good management of natural resources can deliver us biodiversity benefits, can mitigate climate change, can prevent land degradation, can protect our soil and water resources. There are many social cultural benefits for people being able to live on their country, on their land, and to do their activities and to promote their cultural learning. Obviously, there are economic benefits for generating jobs on country, jobs in remote locations. There are a range of ecosystem services benefits for the wider public. Regulation of water and climate, protecting biodiversity, which are huge global challenges. If indigenous people are managing 50% of the land mass, and the government's plan to invest in enhancing indigenous people's capabilities and recognizing their capabilities, I think we can achieve a lot in addressing the environmental challenges that humanity is facing now. So supporting indigenous peoples and local communities in managing their lands through incentivizing mechanism, I guess, to me, is the key to manage natural resources across the globe. Currently, the global value of ecosystem services markets is worth about between $36 to $42 billion a year. And the key sectors that play a role in that is indigenous land use, pastoral land use, and agriculture. And as I've already highlighted, that indigenous peoples, they play a key role, and we need to recognize and we need to actually support them in continuing the sustainable cultural practices to manage the land that could help them to sustain their livelihoods, as well as to deliver ecosystem services for many non-indigenous communities or the mainstream society. If we look at the business front, corporates are already looking for social license to operate under their corporate social responsibility. You may have heard about this United Nations Finance Initiative that was established in 1992. Under this initiative, the UN is working actively with the banks, insurers, and investors to create a sustainable finance sector. And about 130 banks are already partners in this initiative. So there is a demand within the corporate sector to invest in sustainable or payment for ecosystem services kind of opportunities. Recently, in September 2020, there has been a United Nations General Assembly where more than 560 businesses have agreed to reverse nature's laws. And these 560 businesses, their combined revenue is worth about US dollars, about $4 trillion a year. This includes Microsoft, Unilever, Walmart, and many others. These companies are, that means saying this, that they are very committed to meet their corporate social responsibility and to invest in eco-friendly ways, finding solution to the problems. And indigenous land management practices, as well as the land that they manage, can offer real solutions in this space. So supporting IPLCs to manage their lands can also deliver us holistic development, which is being addressed by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look at supporting indigenous people living on their land, driving their livelihoods, and also managing land in a sustainable way, that means that we can sustain our natural environment to continue delivering the flow of ecosystem services. Supporting local communities can also get recognition for their environmental stewardship, because usually we lack that in our formal arrangements. If we support indigenous communities, it also helps us to address 9 out of 17 those sustainable development goals directly. So it's a very efficient mechanism. Excuse me. It's a very efficient mechanism to do the investment and to develop the mechanisms for, or the channels for proper investment. I think that's what most of the work is needed. So my key message is that we need to understand the true value of indigenous peoples and local communities managed lands for the local and wider global public. So there are huge well-being benefits that many of us enjoy. I enjoy sitting here. People enjoy sitting across the globe. And we don't realize that somebody is doing something that is helping us to sustain on this planet. They're not, the indigenous people and local communities in this space particularly have not been extractive as the mainstream society has been to date. So we need to recognize the importance of IPLCs, land management and cultural practices. Carbon economy across Northern Australia, it demonstrates the range of benefits that are available for the wider public. We also need to develop culturally appropriate ecosystem services-based incentivized mechanisms. And that's where I think we need to focus our efforts, that if we develop these culturally appropriate incentivized mechanisms, which are befitting indigenous context as well as the business context, then we can all work together a lot further and achieve both environmentally sustainable development as well as socially sustainable development, addressing those goals. One thing I would like to highlight here, that along with indigenous communities, we also got local communities who equally contribute in sustaining our natural resources. So we need to recognize both the indigenous communities as well as the local communities who have been using their resources sustainably and helping us to enjoy the ecosystem services that flow from the lands that they managed over the centuries. So with this, I would like to just provide an outline for this book that we have compiled on sustainable land sector development in Northern Australia. This beautifully provides the ecological, social, cultural, and economic background about land development across Northern Australia, and may be relevant to some other places across the globe. And I would like to thank you all. I will be available for Q&A. So if there are any questions, please let me know. I have written my email on the first slide. So I look forward to hear from you. Thank you.